Mesdames et messieurs, j'aimerais vous inviter à vous asseoir. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to take your seats? I know that some other colleagues will be joining us, but I also know that you who are already here and on time are keen to hear our speaker, so we're going to start. Bonsoir, my name is Margaret Huber. It's my pleasure as the president of the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch to warmly welcome special guest speaker Nigel Inkster, Senator Vern White of the Security and Intelligence Committee, former deputy ministers and ambassadors, current international affairs practitioners, distinguished academics, visitors from Europe, the United States, and Australia, leaders of today's associations, institutes, and companies, those here who are studying at Ottawa's fine universities and colleges. In short, all you ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue. We're delighted at the number and breadth of tonight's attendance of former and current practitioners, as well as the students who will be tomorrow's international affair leaders. It is thanks to our partners tonight, SecDev, and the Canadian Association of Security and Intelligence Studies. As Rafal Rohozinski, chair of our International Futures Working Group, CEO of SecDev, and organizer of tonight's event, was suddenly called to New York to participate in one of the UN committees. Alex Corbet has joined us, and I will be shortly asking Alex to introduce our special guest. And Greg Fife will be moderating the talk and Q&A. Let me first, however, mention some upcoming events organized by the National Capital Branch. September 19, next Monday, the CIC Politics and the Pub and Innovation will focus on innovation and the digital economy. In cooperation with Innovation, Science, Economic Development Canada for their innovation policy review. This follows up Ehsan Torkaman and the other members of the Politics in the Pub had held a very successful event on June 27 in international development in cooperation with Global Affairs. On September 30, the CIC's National Capital Branch MIDI Study Group is organizing an event during the 10th annual Ottawa Peace Festival, and the chair, George Jacoby, will be taking the lead for CIC. There will be a focused discussion on the internet and social media, as well as the conflict in Syria. And those of you who are free at noon on that day, it's taking place at the Public Library's auditorium. On October the 17th, I'm pleased to advise you that our partner, the panel, is organizing an event on immigration policy at the Chateau Laurier. Also in the works is a pre-US elections special event, and the details are now being finalized by David Holton in collaboration with Global Affairs. Next, although well known to many of you, let me note that our moderator tonight is indeed well suited for tonight's discussion. Greg Fife, the president of the Canadian Association of Security and Intelligence Studies, has, among many past senior portfolios, been PCO's senior official in charge of security and intelligence. He has an MA from UBC, a bachelor's from Queen's in political science and history. Alexander Corbet is the lead analyst with the SecDev group, focusing on conflict and cyberspace. He has advised the United Nations on the terrorist use of the internet. He's reported on Hezbollah from Beirut, Lebanon, and other parts of the Middle East. Following degrees from the University of Toronto, he studied conflict management at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Alexander's articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Globe and Mail, amongst others. He sits on the board of the NATO Association of Canada. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you and good evening. Welcome again to China's rising cyber power, assessing the implications. I have the pleasure tonight to introduce our distinguished speaker, a man with a wealth of knowledge and experience in the field of cybersecurity, among others. Nigel Inkster is Director of Future Conflict and Cybersecurity at the Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, in London. There, his work focuses on a number of pertinent issues to tonight's theme, including transnational terrorism, insurgency, transnational organized crime, intelligence, the evolution of conflict, and of course, cybersecurity. He's also at the forefront of diplomatic activities with regards to China's cyber abilities, including a Sino-UK Track 1.5 cybersecurity dialogue. He's written extensively on tonight's topic, including a IISS Strategic Dossier on the evolution of the cyber domain, a chapter on the Chinese intelligence agency's use of cyber, and a book published this year, China's Cyber Power, copies of which are available for purchase tonight. A highly accomplished individual, Mr. Inkster served for 31 years in the British Secret Service, the SIS, or more commonly known to many in the room who are James Bond fans as MI6. He has had postings in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and worked on the board of SIS for 7 years, the last 2 of which as Assistant Chief and Director for Operations and Intelligence. On the way over here, I asked Mr. Inkster for some stories about his time in China and Hong Kong. I asked him for the funny ones. He said those are classified. So this is what I can tell you. From the 1980s up until 1997, he played a role in the negotiations around the status of Hong Kong. His last 3 years was with Governor Chris Patten, who is loved by the Chinese, but also found a little bit, I think, pesky by the Chinese for promoting democracy inside of Hong Kong. But Nigel told me that he ended his career, the last part of his career, he said around the last 3 years, having a very positive, friendly relationship with the Chinese. He definitely has some insights that are unique to all of us in this room, and I look forward to hearing him talk about that. In addition to his work with the SIS, he's also the former chairman of the World Economic Forum's Committee on Terrorism and a current member of its Council on Cybersecurity. So without further ado, cybersecurity expert and author, Nigel Inkster.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here this evening to listen to me. It's a great pleasure to be back in Ottawa, a capital that I had occasion to visit on numerous occasions in a former life, and just now and again in my current life, you know, to conform with you know, Canadian custom and tradition. I just like to say que je suis très content de me trouver ici, pas dans le plein IV. Yeah. I feel, you know, tonight a little bit like the prospective seventh husband of the Hollywood starlet Zsa Zsa Gabor, one of the first people ever perhaps to be famous for being famous, and interviewed by a member of the media and asked about his feelings in relation to the impending nuptials. This gentleman, whose name I can't actually remember, said, well, you know, I know what it is that I've got to do, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to make it interesting. But I'll do my best. The topic, you know, I've been asked to talk about and I want to talk about is encapsulated in the title of the book that I've just published, China's Cyber Power. In a way, that title, you know, is perhaps a bit misleading. I mean, we had to call the book something, and my suggestions to our editorial team that we simply call it The Thing were unaccountably disregarded. But, you know, and of course it does deal with China's, you know, cyber capabilities, cyber policies, and cyber strategies. But what it really tries to do is to really look at the whole question of China's struggle for a modern identity and self-respect through the prism of the cyber domain. And it kind of reflects you know, some of my own preoccupations and obsessions. You know, I've been involved with China for an awful long time from different perspectives. You know, first went there at the end of 1976, just after the Gang of Four had been overthrown and the Cultural Revolution formally brought to an end. And I now find myself, as Alex mentioned, leading a UK team involved in paradiplomatic activities with China on issues of cyber security. So, you know, it seemed to me that if there was one book I was going to write, you know, this really needed to be it. And I think the issue of China's struggle for modernity is important in this context, because if we think about the image we now have of China as a modern, self-confident country of megacities with endless skyscrapers, freeways, you know, maglev railways, modern airports, etc., etc. I think this is a process of modernity that really only took hold to a degree that was no longer susceptible to challenge in the mid 1990s, which is exactly the time that the internet arrived in China. And for China's leadership, blinking into the daylight at the end of the Cultural Revolution, everything was about the search for economic modernization. That became the priority, the overarching priority. And in this context, China's leadership very quickly became seized of the importance of information communications technologies to promote and foster this process. I remember as a young officer in Beijing in the early 1980s, handing out seemingly endless copies of Alvin Toffler's works, The Third Wave and Future Shock, which were avidly consumed by China's intelligentsia and, as we now know, leadership. And Tofflin had some very interesting and prescient things to say about how information communications technology was going to reshape quite fundamentally pretty much every aspect of our lives. One leader in particular, Jiang Zemin, before he became secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, was seized of the importance of this new technology, and he was very instrumental in pushing its importance. And in a way, that is a difference between what happened with the United States, let us say, and China, because in the USA, the internet was about privatization of ARPANET, deregulation of a rather sclerotic domestic telecommunications sector, and then standing aside and letting the private sector do what it could with the new technology. In China, the evolution of the cyber domain, the evolution of the internet, has been the product of a series of top-down leadership initiatives designed to push forward the role that these capabilities would play in national development. And yes, of course, there was a significant private sector component. A lot of young Chinese who studied in the West, served their time in Silicon Valley, then went back to start up their own enterprises, some of which have since become globally recognized brands. But is a very, very different approach, which of course reflects a very different political and philosophical systems that are involved. So we saw China recognizing the importance of ICT, allowing the internet into China. I don't think it really got going for ordinary people until 1996, but from there it blossomed very rapidly, and we've now got a China that is the world's largest user community. The number keeps on growing. And although originally internet access was largely through internet cafes, the absolute tsunami of development of mobile communications and social media has been what's driven the adoption of the internet and ICT within China. For the Chinese government, ICT, the internet, is absolutely central to everything that they're trying to do. In terms of economic development, it's seen as absolutely imperative to taking China beyond the middle income trap, which, depending on your point of view, they're either in or about to get into. They have this ambitious strategy called Internet Plus, which is basically designed to integrate the real world and the digital economies, and to develop a vibrant market in digital goods and services within China. There is an important social component to the internet. Actually, resonances with a former political movement in Canada, social credit, remember that? There is this policy now in China of promoting a system that basically enables the government to assess and evaluate the loyalty and commitment of its citizenry, and hence their entitlement to access social services through an analysis of their online activity. It may seem somewhat Orwellian, but this is what is being attempted. We're also seeing China looking at adopting and bringing in information communication technologies and the cyber domain into its military capabilities. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because what we're seeing there is a really fascinating and quite remarkable evolution. And beyond that, the cyber domain is playing an increasing role in the enabling of a Chinese intelligence community that even a couple of decades ago really didn't amount to much more than a focus on espionage against the military-industrial complex of the United States of America, but in many ways was actually quite risk-averse and limited in what it could do. That has changed quite remarkably. But last of all, and I think, and I argue in the book, most importantly, this has been transformational for China's approach to foreign and security policy, and has been an important factor, and I would argue a growing factor, in the more self-confident, well, more assertive, let us say, China that we have begun to recognize as the new reality. When I started, well, let me go back and talk about how China, how the internet evolved within China, because I think this is very important to understand. As the internet took hold, it became evident to China's leadership that this was taking them into new and uncharted territory in relation to the extent to which their population was going to be able to access information in ways that had never previously been possible, and enabled them to express publicly views that previously would not have been countenanced. And this, of course, was recognized early as a challenge, but I don't think probably many of the senior Chinese leadership actually realized quite how much of a challenge it was until they began to confront the day-to-day reality of a Chinese social media milieu, which is sort of noisy, rambunctious, anarchic, rather like China itself. And how to control this? Well, I would argue that the Chinese state has done a remarkably effective job in doing what Bill Clinton said could not be done, namely nailing Jello to the wall. I think the Chinese have found out how to do this. They've managed, and this was not that difficult given the relatively small number of international internet access points they had, to monitor, filter, and block externally generated content that they do not wish to see being accessed by their own population. They've invested hugely in an army of online censors equipped with now very sophisticated software that enables them to monitor and, where necessary, take down individual blog posts within minutes of these appearing online. They have made it clear to Chinese service providers that they are responsible for policing and monitoring content on their network in line with laws and regulations that are so vaguely drawn as to be effectively all-encompassing. And they have also got the famous 50-cent party, which actually turns out to be a large number of Chinese public servants, civil servants, who go online pretending to be ordinary Chinese citizens, engage in discourse, promote the government line, and, where necessary, steer potentially contentious discussions towards safer waters. Yes, there are those Chinese who access the outside world through various means, but these people are readily identifiable and they can be dealt with where necessary. Within China, the phenomenon of star bloggers, so-called big Vs, people who have very large followings, have basically been closed down by the Chinese state, told basically either stop blogging or some means will be found to bring them down. This doesn't mean that you don't have a lively environment for discussion within Chinese social media. You do, and actually there is still quite a lot of tolerance for what previously might have been seen as dissent. But I think it's really all happening within a gilded cage, because I think the Chinese authorities believe that they do have technical dominance here and that they can that they can ride the back of this tiger, and indeed they have made a virtue of this by espousing internationally, I'll come to this later, the philosophy, the concept of internet sovereignty, the idea that nation states, governments should have the right to monitor and police the content that transits their sovereign areas. And we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years China becoming more assertive and unabashed in advocating this particular approach, particularly through the former head of the Cyberspace Administration of China, Lu Wei. We have seen the emergence of a fascinating counterculture of cyber dissonance, an entire lexicography of terms that are used to refer to, in disparaging ways, the censorship regime. But, you know, the regime exists. So that's that aspect of it. The second aspect I wanted to talk about was the issue that was dominating global headlines when I began researching and writing my book, which was the whole question of state-sponsored Chinese cyber industrial espionage. I deal with that in fair degree of detail in the book. And to cut a long story short, I argue, this will come as little surprise to most of you, that broadly speaking, the Chinese are guilty as charged. You may not be able to make the case to a beyond reasonable doubt standard, but you certainly can to a balance of probabilities standard. If you add up all the factors, the sheer volume and sustained nature of these attacks, and which other state would have the capability and indeed the incentive to do this, the extent to which the targets map so closely with successive iterations of China's 5-year plans, the extent to which the kind of liturgical rhythm of these attacks maps closely with the Chinese working day, including knocking off for lunch at 11:59 precisely, and so on and so forth. All of these things really do kind of add up, I think, to a case that realistically is very difficult to rebut. And indeed, although the Chinese Foreign Ministry manfully, or womanfully now, continued to assert that China was innocent of these allegations and itself was the victim of extensive cyber exploits, as exemplified by the revelations of one Edward Snowden. In private, Chinese securocrats were actually quite ready to admit that this activity was going on. Their line of argument was that everybody did this, that US efforts to try to distinguish between ordinary, decent state-on-state espionage and intellectual property theft were spurious and hypocritical, and in any case, for China, economic development to prevent social instability was a critical national security concern. So basically, they were going to do it. I think left those of us who had a deeper engagement on the issue in little doubt what was going on here. What we saw was a very disparate array of capabilities, ranging from China's own intelligence services, the third department of the PLA, the Signals Intelligence Agency, the Ministry of State Security, which has its own cyber exploit remit, actually under the authorization of 3PLA, but a lot of quasi-official cyber militias, effectively privateers operating under a letter of marque, and a lot of private actors who are operating on a more opportunistic basis, and which translated into multiple noisy, uncoordinated exploits against the same target, often with actually very low levels of technical tradecraft, although often quite interesting and ingenious ways of approaching the targets that they were interested in, using social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc., and starting several degrees of separation from where they eventually wanted to be. There's been extensive writing about how these operations have been done. I can talk more about them if anybody's interested. And for a long time, I think the important thing was, well, two things. Firstly, that this whole issue became a major irritant in Sino-US relations. And it was a situation where, for a long time, the United States government and its major allies, including the United States and Canada, seemed powerless to be able to muster any kind of response. In essence, China seemed to be, getting away with this. So, there seemed to be nothing anyone could do. I think what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is a really fascinating example by the United States of cross-domain retaliation, because rather than retaliate against China in the cyber domain, and of course we had a significant disparity of vulnerability here. Put crudely, there was a lot of stuff that China wanted to steal from the West. There was relatively little stuff that the West wanted to steal from China. So there was, this disparity of vulnerabilities here. What we saw the United States doing was progressively to pursue legal response, firstly through the indictment of PLA officers identified as heavily involved in some of the major exploits against US corporations, and at the end of 2015, a message to the Chinese to the effect that if this did not stop, legal action would be pursued against Chinese state and private sector entities deemed to be beneficiaries of stolen intellectual property. This led to a communique by President Xi Jinping and President Obama at the end of last year that neither country would use cyber capabilities to purloin each other's intellectual property. And in some senses, I think this has actually been quite effective. Certainly, if you look at some of the major US private sector cybersecurity companies like Mandiant and FireEye, they are recording a significant downturn in the sort of intrusions and exploits that they had made a nice living from discovering and analyzing. I haven't seen a similar drop-off in attacks against other major Western countries. Indeed, if anything, there seems to have been an upturn here. But I think there are a number of reasons why actually China may have decided to dial this back. Firstly, the very real implications of legal actions pursued against Chinese entities, more than ever before engaged overseas with assets that are held overseas and hence liable to distraint in pursuit of legal action. I think also there may have started to be an element of diminishing returns around this form of espionage. And thirdly, and I think this is actually quite important, China does have a significant incentive for domestic purposes to rein in its more extravagant beltway bandits. The Chinese domestic cyber environment is notoriously unhygienic. Levels of cyber criminality within China itself are eye-wateringly high. China is, in any case, a notably low-trust society. And if the Chinese state really wants to promote their Internet Plus strategy, integration of real-world and digital economies and promotion of China as a major market in digital goods and services, they need to clean up their own domestic act. Finally, it seems to me that one of the consequences of the recent major PLA reorganization that has taken place is that China's SIGINT agency, which had had a nice sideline in moonlighting, collecting intelligence for state-owned enterprises in the private sector, has basically been told by the Chinese leadership to stop it and concentrate on doing military stuff. So all of these things have kind of come together. And I argue in the book that we may look back on what we saw over the last decade by China as a kind of equivalent of an adolescent growing pain. This is not, however, to say that China is going to stop cyber exploitations against the West. What we are now seeing, I think, is a more cautious, more discriminating approach, increasingly involving multiple different capabilities. So, whereas in the past, Chinese hackers would have come up against the wall, interesting, there must be something important behind it, let's punch a way through. We're now seeing them stop at the wall, take stock and think, okay, well, maybe we should try and get a human source around the back of this wall rather than just punch through as we might have done in the past. Also, we're seeing that China's intelligence agencies have been very significantly enabled by these new capabilities, and there can be no doubt that China's leadership are receiving quantities of intelligence that they could not have imagined possible 10 or 15 years ago. We're seeing the Ministry of State Security using these capabilities more actively and aggressively to monitor and constrain the behavior of China's critics beyond China's frontiers. The big question, which I don't feel qualified to answer, is what in policy terms does China do with this intelligence? Are they able to take it at face value for what it's worth? Or are we seeing within China a situation similar to what we saw at the end of, during the Soviet Union, and acknowledged as such by Viktor Chebrikov, the last chairman of the KGB, that the Soviet Union had some really good sources of intelligence, but their product had to be so filtered through a prism of ideological correctness as to deprive it of much of its value. I don't know the answer to that question. If anyone else has any thoughts, I'd be interested to hear it. I'd like to turn very briefly to the military because here too the cyber domain plays a critical role in enabling a military transformation that over the last couple of decades has been quite startling. A transition from mass mobilization, low-tech, land-based army configured basically to fight just the other side of China's own borders to an increasingly modern military apparatus with the Navy in the lead, designed increasingly to project power overseas with a focus on joint operations, linking cyber, space, and nuclear within a single continuum. This has been a remarkable transformation. China's military thinkers have been writing about the role of the cyber domain in future conflict very extensively, and particularly looking at issues of information warfare and considering ways in which information warfare capabilities might in future conflicts be used preemptively and in a deterrence mode to actually discourage potential adversaries from moving to the point of actual kinetic hostilities. It's a work in progress, like with all militaries. It's very easy to talk in conceptual terms about how the cyber domain changes the character of conflict in the modern world. Operationalizing it is an altogether different issue, as everybody in this sector is finding out. But while the Chinese, formally speaking in international negotiations, maintain the position that we should not militarize the internet, we shouldn't talk about the role of the laws of armed conflict in the cyber domain, because to do this will kind of summon up the spirits that we don't want to summon up. The reality is that they are as actively militarizing the internet as anybody else as part of their revolution in military affairs with Chinese characteristics. And the final thing that I want to touch upon in all of this is the implications of the cyber domain for China's foreign policy, something that effectively China opted not to have since Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms began in the late 1970s, until, I would argue, the mid-years of the last decade. And the key date, I think, in all of this was 2008, the financial crisis, an event whose implications within China, I think, relatively few of us fully appreciated at the time, but which effectively persuaded China's leadership that in the Washington Consensus they had been invited to worship a false god. And since then, I think we have seen a fairly persistent trajectory leading towards a more assertive China, a China that is not setting out to be a non-status quo power any longer, but a country that is increasingly demanding to be taken seriously. This is what Xi Jinping's China dream is all about, a China that is more assertively defending and promoting its own interests, and as I mentioned earlier, in the cyber domain, asserting a value system that is actually very different from that which has dominated the global discourse and global dispensation since the end of World War II. It's not that the Chinese ideology has an export model per se. It does not. But we have seen in China a discourse of victimhood and grievance and a kind of Leninist paranoia, a conviction that the West is bent on subverting China and overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party, increasingly inform China's leadership worldview. And it seems to me that the Chinese leadership has decided that the only way to deal with this is to push back hard and to assert a very different value system, a value system that they know is not going to have any impact or resonance with the Western liberal democracies, but which does have significant resonance in countries of the developing world. And we see this in the cyber domain. We see China getting much more actively involved in international negotiations on cyber governance and on cyber security, pushing for an international regime that is top-down, government-led, under the aegis of the United Nations, and backing this up by using the capabilities of their national champions, companies like Huawei and ZTE, to create and develop core backbone communication structure in countries of the developing world. Whereas we in the West, when we talk about capacity building in the cyber domain, tend to spend a lot of time waffling on about human rights and civil liberties. We tend to lose sight of the fact that what countries in the developing world want is kit and capabilities. And this is what China preeminently provides. At the end of my book, I kind of sum this up by saying that in the cyber domain, I think what we're seeing is tantamount to a global experiment conducted by China in which the liberal Western democracies serve as a control group. That essentially we're seeing two different visions of the global cyber domain emerging. And whether these two versions are destined to exist in separation, whether they will interact, continue to interact, and if so, how this will be, and what will be the long-term impact in terms of global governance, balance of power, and global value systems, I think are a set of interesting questions which we're not yet in a position fully to answer, but which we collectively need to start thinking about rather seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to have about 25 to 30 minutes of questions. There's a mic over here so that everybody will be able to hear your question. When you get up, could you identify yourself so that everyone knows who you are, and make your question as compact as possible so that we can get as many in as possible.
My name is Jean Daudelin. I teach at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. You mentioned that the US was able to deter China from using its cyber warfare capabilities for industrial purposes. What happens to the countries that don't have what the US has to deter China? Yeah. Countries like Europe and countries like Canada.
Yeah. A very good question. Well, I think at the moment is that that China is basically focusing some of the activities it was directing against the United States, against countries in Europe and Canada, and like Europe and Canada and Australia. And we've certainly seen nothing like that. As far as I'm aware, we've seen nothing like the same drop-off in these countries as we've seen in the United States, if anything, the reverse. The United States is working hard to try and engage the support of other countries to pursue the same sort of policy, including cases brought through the WTO mechanism. And I think finding it frustrating that it's not really getting the kind of traction and take-up that it would like to see. But of course, the reality is that other countries simply do not have, the collective national power and clout that the United States evidently does. So it is, I think, a more unequal contest. In the case of Europe, well, the European Union represents considerable leverage, not least because China is very anxious to achieve recognition as a market economy, and at the moment the European Union is the major barrier to that aspiration. So potentially, Europe can play a significant role in leveraging this advantage that it has. I have to say, I'm not optimistic that they will find it easy to do so. And in this context, I think Brexit does not help, because it's clear that China now sees this as a breach in Europe's defenses, perceives that the United Kingdom, which has in the past been more favorable towards granting China market economy status, can be further wooed in pursuit of this, for China, important objective.
And how about Canada?
Well, you probably know better than I do. I'm not sure what Canada's leverage really is in this regard. I mean, unless you choose to associate yourself more closely with the United States behavior and approaches, I can't, off the top of my head, identify another way that's going to have the desired impact.
While we're waiting for someone else to formulate a question, I'll give the mic to Alex.
All right. Thank you, Nigel, for that really interesting conversation, and definitely for touching on Brexit there as well, is going to be my first question. My second question, and this stems from the beginning of your talk when you're talking about the kind of domestic limitations and monitoring applications that China has domestically. With regards to your last comment there about kit and capabilities, what have we seen in terms of the proliferation of Chinese technologies overseas, particularly in the developing world, and how has this limited access or free access to the internet in the developing world?
Well, what we have seen is, as I said in the talk, Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE providing a lot of core backbone infrastructure to countries in the developing world, particularly, though not exclusively, sub-Saharan Africa. And these capabilities are offered on fairly generous terms, and typically tend to be, build, operate, maintain, operate. So you can buy the entire package. Now, this is a situation that is not without its critics in the countries concerned, because of course this build, maintain, operate approach effectively denies these countries the ability to develop their own indigenous expertise in these areas. So it is a matter of some contention. But the fact is that what the Chinese are providing is pretty good infrastructure. And in this context, I think it's important not to continue laboring under the delusion that China is simply copying what we've already got and remains kind of one generation back. In many regards, that still is true. But in some respects, China's engineering ambitions are significant, and their capabilities for achieving them increasingly so. I was amused to note that whilst I was in the United States last week, the best I could get was 3G connectivity. In China, I would take 4G connectivity for granted, and China is actively pursuing 5G capability. We're also seeing that in certain areas, China is looking to invest very heavily in to develop capabilities that are actually designed to leapfrog those of the West. And a very good example of this is the recent satellite launch undertaken by China to test the effectiveness of encryption using quantum entanglement. It's quite clear that China has identified this as one area where they really want to push as hard as they can to see if they can achieve a breakthrough that would actually put them ahead of the West. So the capabilities are there. I mean, Chinese smartphones these days can be pretty good. They offer a lot of functionality and responsiveness to customer demand that is often better than that which we see with major Western providers. And whilst the iPhone is still the option, preferred option for China's elite and intelligentsia, there are actually many indigenous capabilities that can run at a close second. And we've got an interesting situation with China's major national telecommunications champions. Because in many ways they really would like to break free from state control. A company like Huawei, for example, the chairman of Huawei talking about that company's operations in Europe said not so long ago I would like to think that one day people will look at Huawei as not a Chinese company, but as a European company. So they do have these aspirations and ambitions. Having said that, of course, the reality is that they can be and will be called to heel by the Chinese state whenever they can. Apart from developing political goodwill through their provision of capabilities to the developing world, of course, the other thing about the Chinese approach is that it does come values free, and the systems that are provided do provide all the capabilities that would enable the relevant regimes to monitor and filter content in whichever way they see fit. I mean, these things come as standard. They actually come as standard with Western networks as well. But the Chinese seemingly quite happy to provide them. And of course, this network provision does, to some extent, erode US Five Eyes domination of the main global cable traffic routes, and also provides China with access to data, information, and intelligence that it might not otherwise be able to acquire. So it offers China some quite significant advantages.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, my name is Li Mingzhou from New Tang Dynasty TV. You mentioned about the 60 cents police, internet police. As I've heard they have 1 million internet police just posting opinions, not only for Chinese website inside China, but for example, there's a internet chat room in Ottawa. You will see them regularly come on to make comments and trying to guide the opinions of the ethnic Chinese to the to the Communist Party line. What do you think can be done to to stop this, or should Canada do something about it?
Well, I have to say that within China, I think the prospect of external actors being able to do anything to change the situation is limited and diminishing. After all, this is not a new phenomenon for China. It is not simply a product of communism. The Chinese state, throughout the whole of recorded history, has placed a very high premium on intellectual orthodoxy and an intolerance of dissent, which, if you look across the course of Chinese history, has been characterized by periods of relative relaxation, but always followed by periods during which intolerance of dissent and imposition of intellectual orthodoxy becomes more forceful. I mean, it was the case in China until relatively recently that you could be quite vocal in criticizing the Chinese Communist Party and not suffer any adverse consequences. Simply saying, I think Xi Jinping is rubbish would not necessarily have invited reprisals. What would have invited reprisals would have been, I think Xi Jinping is rubbish and we need to do something about it. At that point, any suggestion that you were actually planning to organize would bring the kind of state on your head. Nowadays, we see a much increased levels of intolerance. A couple of years ago, during the Occupy Central movement in Hong Kong, the icon of that movement was the umbrella. Somebody posted on Chinese social media a picture of Xi Jinping carrying an umbrella. No prizes for guessing how long that stayed in circulation. and it's, you know, the boundaries have been tightening. They may loosen again, but if they do loosen, it will be as a result, I think, of indigenous forces and changes in indigenous policies. I do feel, I have to say, that though I'd be the first to defend and espouse Western liberal values, Western finger wagging has proved remarkably ineffectual in influencing Chinese conduct, and I think that will continue to be the case. In terms of our economic and other forms of technical leverage, well, it remains the case that China is still heavily dependent on Western ICT, Western hardware, Western software, but they're acutely aware of this dependence and are working as hard as they can to reduce it and to constrain the ability of the scope for Western ICT companies, in which context I think that the efforts of entities such as Facebook to kind of get into the Chinese market by whatever means may be successful in the short term, but I think will probably end in tears. Internationally, I think it's true, what you're saying is that we're seeing a more forward-leaning approach by China towards dealing with dissent and towards shaping discourse in other countries in favor of Chinese national narratives. I think that countries have got to decide how much they care about this, and if they do care about it and want to do something, then they need to act firmly to discourage China from engaging in this behavior.
Can I ask a quick question? How much security do you consider Huawei a kind of a security threat?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has been a long-running discussion in a number of countries, including my own. And in a former life, I was very much involved in it. British Telecoms relies very heavily on Huawei components for its, for its own core backbone infrastructure. In recent years, an agreement has been reached to set up a facility at Banbury in Oxfordshire where members of the British Signals Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, are able to examine all Huawei components and all Huawei code and software to see whether there are any security vulnerabilities there that need to be dealt with. They haven't found any. This is hardly surprising, because I think that if Huawei infrastructure were to be used to launch some kind of major cyber attack against the UK infrastructure, it would come in the form of a zero-day exploit. There wouldn't have been anything to see until the actual attack takes place. I'm sure this is a very useful intelligence gathering exercise for GCHQ. It is something that Huawei does slightly through gritted teeth, and certainly Chinese counterparts with whom I have discussed this make clear they see this as a somewhat humiliating situation, which appears to emphasize the lack of trust that the UK has in Huawei, and it's certainly not a model that they wish to see replicated elsewhere in the world. I think it's a difficult judgment. How much vulnerability is implied by reliance on Chinese components and Chinese software. There obviously must be concerns about issues such as supply chain integrity. My own view, for what it's worth, is that that's probably less of a risk. And if you look at cases where governments elsewhere have denied Huawei the ability to take part in major government contracts, Australia being a very good example, that was nothing to do with Huawei. That was all about retaliation for something else the Chinese did.
Okay. Next questioner, please.
Thank you very much for your talk, sir. My name is Elliot Cho. I am a graduate student at Carleton University, first year MA in political science. The one question I have for you is that it has to do with the China's defense strategy or policy. Now, I'm sure that some of you have heard this term called A2AD, it's short for anti-access and area denial.
Yeah.
It's basically China's strategy to deter any kind of American influence in Northeast Asia in case of there's actually ever a full-scale conflict happens between US and China. And from my limited knowledge, this has to do with a lot with the installing lots of like the anti-ship missiles to deter any kind of access of the US Navy in the seas, like the South China Sea, and even to the East Sea, or what Japanese likes to call it as the Sea of Japan. So what would be the role of China's cyber warfare capacity in this defense strategy or the policy?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right to talk about anti-access area denial, A2AD, as being at the heart of China's current defense strategy, and it's certainly been the driver for the development of many of the modern systems, in particular missile systems that China has been developing in recent years, and that the aim of A2AD is essentially to prevent the United States from gaining access to the Taiwan Straits in time to prevent an armed takeover of Taiwan. That in essence is what A2AD has been about. Not about defeating the United States, but achieving an outcome that arguably renders a US attempt to enter the Taiwan Straits as otiose, because by the time they get there, the deed will have been done. I think we need to look now beyond A2AD, because China's military aspirations, I think, now go further, as I mentioned, and they're increasingly looking to develop blue water capabilities and a capacity, if necessary, to project military power further afield, beyond the first island chain, maybe up to and even conceivably beyond, in due course, the second island chain. And in all of this, they don't want to go to war with the United States, because I think they recognize that a full-blown military conflict between China and the United States is something that neither side would actually win, but would be potentially incredibly costly. What China wants, I believe, is to have the capacity to take on the United States militarily, should the need ever arise, should they be put in a situation where they really have no choice, but they will want to avoid that if they can. The cyber component of all of this, well, it takes a variety of forms. I mentioned the whole issue of China's use of information warfare for deterrent purposes. And this is an area where we have very little, if anything, in the way of formally published Chinese doctrine. And there really is nothing. So one has to kind of deconstruct the writings of various military-affiliated think tanks and individual military specialists to try and work out what is going on here. And believe me, some of this stuff is really, really boring to read. But what I think we can kind of extrapolate from what is out there is that in the event of a potential conflict, we could expect to see China doing what China has always done in the past, which is increasingly to ratchet up the kind of threat rhetoric for deterrent purposes. And certainly the cyber domain would be used for this. And I think we could expect that in an impending conflict situation, there's a very real possibility that China might be tempted to launch cyber attacks against its adversary that are designed to be as damaging and all-encompassing as they can be, without kind of regard for proportionality or distinction. In the hope that by so doing, the adversary might be prevailed upon to reconsider. So that I think is a very real possibility, and it may be that China might feel that it, in such circumstances, having launched a first cyber strike, might be able to retreat beyond its own kind of cyber wall and be relatively immune from retaliatory in-domain attacks. They would, on the other hand, of course, have to calculate the risks of cross-domain escalation. And that's something that the Chinese military appear to recognize, but don't seem to want to talk about in a great deal of detail. Of course, modern military capabilities are increasingly cyber-enabled, and if we look at the recent PLA reforms that have led to the creation of the Strategic Support Force, which is basically China's answer to US Cyber Command, and the Strategic Rocket Force as a full service arm, I think that does reflect a very real Chinese appreciation of the nexus between cyberspace in particular and nuclear in this area.
Okay, I think we'll have to end it there. No, we've got to cut. Before I turn it over to Margaret to thank Nigel, I just want to say on behalf of CASIS that we're having a conference on the 23rd of September on cyber. I put some sheets around, and if you have any questions or if you want further information, you can talk to me.
In recent weeks, there has been considerable coverage in the Canadian media about the armored vehicle exports by a Canadian-owned firm, Streit. But perhaps we and our media should be paying more attention to cyber capability, whether that of China, the DPRK, North Korea, and others. And we're most grateful indeed to our guest speaker tonight, Nigel Inkster, for giving us, especially those of us who are non-experts in the field, a much greater knowledge base on which to develop our views. I'm also grateful to you, Nigel, as well as to Greg and Alex for helping us to launch the beginning of our fall season in so spectacular and marvelous a way. Thank you very much indeed. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in a very warm round of applause for our guest speaker. I also take this opportunity to thank the Sheraton Hotel, to thank our very hardworking staff, Snooki Lomo, Christina Warren, Greg Jacoby, and others who have worked on tonight's event. Sure hope to see you all at future events. À la prochaine.